Hi everyone, my name is Fonie Mitsopoulou. I am a third-year student, history and politics student at Balliol College, University of Oxford, and the interviews editor for the Oxford Political Review. Today, we're very lucky to be able to talk to Professor John Ikenberry, one of the most famous and prolific exponents of liberalism and international relations theory. Some of his most well-known works involve After Victory and Liberal Leviathan, and in 2020, his new book, A World Safe for Democracy, was published. He's currently teaching at Princeton University, but has also recently acted as visiting professor at Oxford's own Balliol College. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us, Professor Ikenberry.
Great to be here, Fonie. Great to be online with you today.
Thank you. I was hoping to start off and talk a bit with you about democracy, and more specifically about your newest book, A World Safe for Democracy. For our viewers who haven't read it yet, could you talk us through the main thesis that you bring to the table in this?
Yes, my new book really follows a career of interest in how modern states build international order, and this book is really focused on the body of thinking and projects associated with liberal internationalism. And so the book is attempting to reconstruct this body of ideas, these agendas, and it's really about the rise of liberal democracy, beginning in the age of democratic revolutions in the late 18th and early 19th century, and the really 200 or 250 year story of how liberal democracies have sought to build international order, repeatedly attempting to create a kind of ecosystem, a kind of environment in which liberal democracies could survive and thrive and project influence and solve problems. So it's really a book about the long tradition. It really comes from a kind of contemporary worry about the future of liberal democracy and the future of liberal international order. It began really the book in a lecture series I gave at the University of Virginia the week after the American presidential election in November 2016, after Trump was elected. And a real sense that then, and to some extent even now, that we've come to a kind of world historical moment, the kind of ending of an era, that over the last 75 years, the liberal democracies in the US as a leading state have had a kind of a powerful run of putting their imprint on the international system. And the book is an attempt to look back and think about that experience, to really do a variety of things, to try to convince the reader that liberal internationalism is a kind of a tradition of thinking and action that has a kind of long history and a certain kind of intellectual gravitas. It's often seen as the rival to realism. And so in some sense, I'm trying to ask the question, well, what is a liberal internationalism as a rival to these other world views, including realism? The second purpose of the book is really to acknowledge not just the accomplishments, but the failures and missteps of liberal internationalism, to try to be honest with where we're at and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And then finally, to look forward to the future, to see where liberal internationalism and a kind of liberal approach to order building might take us in the 21st century.
Okay. And to my understanding, you kind of have this a kind of Whiggish approach to the whole thing about how despite the fact that we have certain setbacks every so often, that we usually are able to restore or at least achieve these elements of liberal international order. And I was wondering, if I haven't misunderstood what's being argued, I was wondering whether you could identify some of these threats to the liberal international order and democracy that you kind of expound upon.
Well, I think that one way to kind of start the conversation is to try to boil down what liberal internationalism is and what the kind of vision and purposes that it entails, and then kind of talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked. As I suggested, liberal internationalism really would have no significance, or would not really exist, if liberal democracies were not rising up and spreading across the global system. So a new type of state emerged really in the 19th century. And in a world of empire, of monarchy, of autocracy, tyranny, and new types of political projects were emerging in the liberal democratic world. And with that emergence of a new type of polity, there was an agenda for building the international environment, the ecosystem, as I've described it in my book, for liberal democracies to operate. And in some ways, the core idea that you can see across 200 years in this body of work is the idea that liberal democracies are vulnerable, are fragile entities, that they're easily overturned and jeopardized by power politics and war and economic upheaval. And so the agenda has been across 200 years, in my rendering of the story, a project of building a container in which liberal democracies can exist. Think of liberal democracies as kind of eggs. And so the project of liberal order building is building an egg box, or building an egg carton in which eggs can exist together in some degree of safety. And that's what the title of the book is referring to, Wilson's famous phrase, to make the world safe for democracy, not, as some have put it, as a crusade to overturn other types of order around the world, but rather literally to make the world safe for democracies as they exist, to create an infrastructure of support for them. And that's the deeper meaning. And so in my book, I try to reorient, if you will, the intellectual essence of liberal internationalism and trace it across these different eras. What has worked and what has failed? I think the greatest moment of accomplishment really occurred after World War II, in the shadow of the Cold War, when liberal democracies found themselves with an opportunity, led by the United States, to build a new type of international order. One of the threads of my work across my books, really going all the way back 20 years to the book called After Victory, is how do powerful states after wars create order? A moment of opportunity when a state or group of states that have found themselves in an unusual momentary position to pick up the pieces after the destruction of the old order and create something new. How do they do it? What do they do? How has that project of order building changed over the different historical eras? And I've argued in After Victory, and I echo the arguments in this new book, that the United States and other liberal democracies have done things differently, and most explicitly and coherently built order that has what I would call liberal characteristics, doing so, as I suggested, after World War II, in the liberal democratic world, creating new types of institutional formations, partnerships, alliances, problem-solving mechanisms. And so the greatest accomplishment has really been building this space from 1945 through the end of the Cold War into the current era, where open societies could operate roughly in an open international space. That's very difficult. I think as IR scholars, the great puzzle for those of us who are focused on how to explain international order is, how can we make sense of the fact that in the 20th century, the most powerful state in the world worked with its partners to try to create a novel kind of international order that would allow societies to be relatively open, promote free trade and exchange, but yet be in an order that would allow them to pursue their complex social purposes, liberty and equality, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence, extraordinary kind of demands for creating an order that would solve multiple purposes. And I think that the great accomplishment of liberal order that shows that it is a kind of formidable approach to international relations is the 75-year accomplishment, creating an order that generated more wealth, more security, and glimmerings of social justice than previous orders had across the ancient and the modern era. So those are the accomplishments. I think you want to ask me about what are the failures, and I think as I try to talk about in this book, liberalism and liberal internationalism is deeply entangled in all the great forces, many of them quite dark forces of the modern era. Empire, imperialism, predatory capitalism, nationalism, great power politics, and of course, liberalism and liberal internationalism emerged and went through cycles of rise and decline over the period that we call the Anglo-American era of hegemony. So it's entangled with everything, really. And one of the things that I try to emphasize in my book is that liberal internationalism as an approach to international order is not a freestanding project that people sign up for and march purposely into the future. It's a, if you will, a flag without an army. It doesn't have a kind of self-standing integrity. It has to work with lots of different other movements and political formations to have some impact on the world. So liberal internationalism has been taken up by powerful liberal states, but those states have other agendas as well. And those agendas are not always so friendly to liberal internationalism. So it's a conflicted tradition, deeply embedded in all the things that we both praise and condemn in the modern era. And so the problem of empire is deeply fraught and tied to and entangled with liberal internationalism. The failure to spread the fruits of modernity as widely as they should be. Developing countries have always been on the periphery of the liberal order and have never gotten all that they want or all that they should get. The problems of entangling liberal internationalism with hegemonic war and struggles across the great power world during the Cold War, more recently with China, Middle Eastern politics, the Iraq War. These are all fraught aspects of international politics, and liberal internationalism, for better or worse, is entangled with all of them.
Right, and you've entirely like preempted me in a lot of these kinds of areas that I want to focus on, but instead of kind of discussing them in the sense of like, oh, they're a bit of a necessary evil and you kind of have to take them with the goods of the liberal international order, I think we could probably like consider whether a lot of these things actually tend to undermine the liberal international order, because I want to talk more specifically about the role of the US, which you generally talk about quite favorably in leading, I guess, this American-led liberal hegemonic order, as you've put it. And I want to talk about the fact that when they're creating what you call this environment, which kind of acts as, this incubator that allows democracy to thrive and all these other liberal institutions, whether a lot of this is kind of a facade behind which the US is able to pursue a lot of like self-interest, which is something you don't shy away from. You've actually, headfirst discussed like how, the US has pursued like self-interest, but a lot of the times, when you have the US exporting democracy, yes, this is in the name of exporting something which is, which is, something that is quite liberal and quite positive. At the same time, they end up doing a lot of damage. But also the US, it's kind of one of those things where it feels like they kind of do whatever they want. I mean, sometimes they've toppled democratic regimes in South America and propped up authoritarian ones. So it's kind of like, can we trust the US at the head of this liberal international order? Sorry for this winding session.
I think you've put your finger on a basic problem, and the implication of what you said is one that I share, which is the problem with the United States is that it hasn't been liberal enough. It hasn't been as consistent and forceful in defending liberal internationalism across time and space. It's compromised. It's found itself doing things that contradict the principles and vision of liberal international order. And I think the important first step to kind of make sense of that is to make it clear that the United States is not synonymous with liberalism or liberal internationalism. It is a powerful state that has lots of different impulses and has acted in the world in ways that cut across the spectrum of realism, liberalism, isolationism, imperialism, racism, liberation support. It's done it all in some ways, and you can put it all on the table and see it. And I think that's important to do. I do say that liberalism and liberal internationalism have been on balance a force for good in inspiring the United States and showing how the US can advance its interests while simultaneously pursuing a kind of enlightened vision of order. And that's in some sense the point I would emphasize at the outset of this discussion about failures, that the United States, to the extent it has been liberal internationalist in the world, it's partly about how it's defined its interests, but it's also been very much and how it defines its ideals, the kind of vision of order that the US has had as a kind of agenda for order building during the period of its dominance in the global system. But it's been very much self-interested, and indeed back to the question of how the US is entangled in empire. The US in the 19th century was both a major force articulating a vision of a post-imperial order. The US founding, the American Revolution, was the first anti-colonial rebellion against European empire. So the US was born in a contest against empire. And of course, it has then, across its history, both engaged in imperial pursuits and put itself up against other empires in World War, undercutting, thwarting, resisting imperial aggression from Europe and Asia. So it's been on both sides. And its post-World War II era that I've suggested provides a kind of gold standard for international order, the most successful order that has done more work for more people than any other order in world history. And I'll defend that proposition today. But it did that not because it was a better state than other states, that it had better ideas, although that may be the case, but that it saw its interest advanced by pushing out and promoting an open, loosely rule-based order, that it didn't see its interests advanced by the continuing encroachment of European and Asian empire, that openness, free trade served its interests, not just its ideals. So I want to agree with you that it's not a selfless idealist state to the extent it's promoted things that we want, you and I. It's done so because it's seen its own national interest advanced by it, and that allows us both to understand the sources of when states might act in a way that we want, but also show the limits of global transformations towards a truly better world.
Yeah, and it's obviously not just like the US. I think this is an issue generally with the West, that is like kind of setting up this new order after the Second World War, and that is continuing it. Because my issue is you end up seeing the situation in which, in building this order, they kind of build it in an image that works for them, and it ends up like perpetuating these neo-imperialist, I guess, situations in which you have like unfair trade and taxation rules, like vis-a-vis, you know, the peripheral countries. And then I'm just wondering, seeing as we're kind of on the same page that this is a thing, it's an issue, are we like, are we ever going to see kind of anyone to challenge any of the countries getting strong enough to challenge this order and challenge like the status quo? And I think a lot of us look to China to be this, but in Liberal Leviathan, you explicitly say China's not there yet. Do you think it ever will be?
Well, I think China is growing and becoming more powerful, and it clearly, as it grows more powerful, will have more impact on the global system. And I think the answer is yes, it will be a major player throughout the 21st century. Whether it will be the dominant state in the global system, whether it will have a chance to do what the United States and Europe has done in the 20th century to use their power to create an order that has a kind of global impact. We don't know. We don't know how powerful China will be as an order builder and a kind of transformer of the old US or Western-led order. And we don't know, to the extent it is powerful and able to engage in order building, what that order will look like. I think most of us think that China will use its power to the extent it can to do what the United States did, which is to make the world friendly to its way of life, to its interests. If the United States, as I've been suggesting today, used its power to try to make the world safe for democracy, China can be easily seen as trying to make the world safe for China, for the Communist Party that runs it, and for a political autocracy and the kind of illiberal, anti-democratic form of polity that China is developing. So it looks like it is a competitor, both geopolitically. It will have power that will be able to challenge the United States, and it will have ideas that will be challenging to the Western liberal vision as well. And therein lies the competition that we're likely to see over the decades to come.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the role of China, I think China presents itself as kind of this competitor in the sense of like, I think it portrays the aid I think the way it extends, the way it extends influence into a lot of these areas, such as the global South, is to portray itself as a more viable, as a more appealing alternative to the US by seeming as though they're like disinterested, they're not coming in to like boss everyone around, and they're very anti-Western and stuff like that. So I feel like China's kind of proposing this alternative that is looking quite appealing to a lot of these countries. And then I was kind of also wondering, in the discussion of alternatives towards the US in general, other than it being a specific country, you said in Liberal Leviathan that the main alternatives to the liberal order have more or less disappeared. Could you expound, could you explain this a bit more? Sorry.
Yeah, just so that listeners can understand, you're talking about a book that I wrote 10 or 12 years ago, and things have changed. I think that China is a more powerful state than it was in that time. So I think that what you're referring to is the post-Cold War era, really beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of Soviet communism, the end of the Soviet Union. China at that point through the 1990s was just beginning its ascent. It was under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping beginning to engage in reform. It was opening up. It was embracing capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and in many ways it was not challenging the United States and the post-Cold War liberal order. It was enjoying the fruits that come from integration into it, not least by joining the WTO and gaining access to trade and investment, and then pursuing what has been an extraordinary story of multiple decades of double-digit economic growth. So China was not, during most of the past 3 decades, a geopolitical or ideological challenger to the United States or to Western liberal order. Quite the contrary, it has had its best decades in many ways. If you think about China across 2 millennia, its most successful decades have been the most recent decades under the auspices of what many people call Pax Americana. So they have been huge beneficiaries of the open capitalist world economy. What they haven't done is embrace the full package, which we associate with liberal values, rule of law, freedom of speech, separation of independent judiciary, all the sorts of things that are part of the package of Western liberal democracy. They have not embraced that. So they have a different kind of polity, and we're going to see to what extent they are able to shape the international system in a way that will allow them to preserve that set of polity principles, and to what extent will they, as a rising global power seeking to organize the world in their own way, to what extent will they find it important to evolve and reform their system, to bring on board cooperation with other countries. So I think the Chinese story of rise and dominance has not been written yet, and those of us who study international relations are simply fascinated by the Chinese ascendancy and what it means, because all of our arguments about history and theory are brought into play as we watch China unfold.
And I guess in this wider discussion, when we're talking about like different alternatives, obviously liberalism is a kind of school of thought which places a lot of importance on democracy, and I kind of wanted, and it kind of, I think, like rests on this kind of binary that democracy is a good thing, non-democracy is a bad thing. But I kind of want to look at how we accommodate countries that fall like in the spectrum between the two, like systems such as benevolent dictatorships like Singapore, or like competitive authoritarian regimes such as those found in the Middle East, which seem to be prospering regardless of not being democratic. And we do get this kind of trade-off of like personal liberties in some of them, but at the same time, how does liberalism, I guess, accommodate these cases is my question within its like, I guess, ideas.
Well, the first part of your question, I think, was getting at whether there are, when you talked about binaries, that was very interesting, because I think you're right that there are a lot of different kinds of states, and as scholars of international relations, we're kind of interested in how they behave, whether they have different kinds of foreign policies, whether they're able to solve different kinds of problems, provide different kinds of goods for their own people and for the wider system. The COVID pandemic has given us a window into different kinds of regimes and different kinds of capabilities. And I think it's fair to say that liberal democracies haven't looked that good in many respects in providing public health and engaging in the kinds of directed mandates that are needed for our publics to protect themselves, take the vaccine, to behave in a way that dampens the impact of the pandemic. And the same would be true with other global problems. Global warming, I think that democracies can be notoriously resistant to paying costs. Elected leaders don't like to run on higher taxes or restricted use of automobiles. So democracies can be vulnerable to the criticism that they aren't capable of making the choices and paying the price for behavior that we want to see emerge in the world. So I think that is absolutely the case. It's not that other kinds of regimes are necessarily all that much better. They're different. China is emitting more carbon than any other country in the world through coal burning, electrical power generation, and it too, although its regime is very different, has not necessarily been the epitome of clean energy, enlightened public policy. So I think it's hard to make a fundamental judgment as to which kind of regime is better at problem solving. I do think we need to separate the question of problem solving from values that we may want. I've not been of the view that values are luxury goods and that all values are equal. I would prefer to live in a society where you have constitutional protections for freedom of speech, independence of the press, independent judiciary, separation of church and state. The whole liberal and Republican theoretical and political tradition of trying to establish limits on power has been extraordinarily transformative in building the modern world that we live in, many of the aspects of which we take for granted. We kind of assume that we can go to universities and we can speak truth to power, as Gandhi put it, incorporated an old Greek idea of what it is to be an independent voice, independent a scholar. A lot of places in the world, you can't take that for granted anymore. The reach of the predatory state in civil society is growing in many countries. The ability of people to feel like they can speak their mind, that they can pursue inquiry, that they can use science and knowledge and take it wherever it leads. Those sorts of freedoms that we kind of take for granted are actually on the global chopping block right now. I have not in my career been at a moment, my career really began in the 1980s. I've not really seen a moment in my career where in some sense we've had to defend those values. We've kind of taken them for granted. We've thought that as a kind of Whiggish conceptions of history, we've kind of assumed that liberal democracy will win out in the end because it's just so darn better than the alternatives. I don't think we can say that with any confidence anymore. And so to the extent we want to, at the end of the 21st century, live in a world where at least part of the world has this kind of polity, then we have to step up and protect it. And I'm speaking now more as a citizen than as an IR scholar. I think we all are kind of wearing both hats. On the one hand, we put on the hat of a scholar and we say, okay, what are the different kinds of political realities out there? What are the different kinds of states? How do we think about geopolitical and ideological competition? Then we put on our hat as a citizen and say, what kind of world do we want to live in? And so it's in that spirit that I wish liberalism and liberal democracy well, because it is on balance, I think, a force for good in the world. And as you said at the very beginning, the criticisms that you and I might agree to as being failures or shortcomings of the United States or Great Britain or the Western liberal democracies are shortcomings and failures that require more rather than less liberalism and liberal democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of what this boils down to, based on your answer, is like kind of where your priorities lie and what kind of trade-offs you're willing to make. I mean, you can have like, you know, an authoritarian regime that's like super efficient, or you can have a democratic regime where you're like guaranteed like, you know, things like, you know, safety from arbitrary arrest or like free speech. So I guess I see where you're coming from. But to kind of wrap up this whole conversation around democracy, I kind of wanted to look at what I've, you know, read as being referred to as the crown jewel of liberalism, which is democratic peace theory and this notion of which was brought up. Okay, so in 1999, you wrote a piece called Why Export Democracy? And from what I understand, the argument kind of boils down to the more democracies you have, for whatever reason, the more international stability and peace you have, be it because of, you know, economic interdependence or for cultural community reasons. But I guess what I was wondering when reading this piece is how is it not kind of an internal contradiction in exporting democracy, which we've seen in practice be kind of this inherently often violent affair? It often leaves countries, you know, worse off than you find them when the US is entering them and kind of, you know, in a sense, raising cities. How does that not undermine this whole notion of like international peace if that's inherently not peaceful, I guess? I don't know. Obviously, I understand there's a lot of critiques to DPT that I'm sure you've had to face, but I feel like this is the one that kind of stood out to me a bit in reading your piece in specific.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think I would start by saying that, putting on my international relations hat again, that if you look at world order across the ancient and modern period, there are two types of order that have been most prevalent. One scholars call anarchy, and realists are famous for providing really theory, and Kenneth Walt's brilliant theory of the structure of anarchy, the dangers that are created in a world where no political authority exists above the state, and so in a decentralized world of competing states, you have chronic insecurity, and states are relentlessly and permanently in a process of mustering power and preparing for war. So the problems of anarchy, which lead to balance and security competition, insecurity, and ultimately war. And the other kind of order that crosses the ancient and modern world is empire, or what we call hierarchy. So it's the opposite of anarchy, it's hierarchy. It's order that's very vertical, where dominant states create order through coercive imposition. And so the world of the world history and the world that the human condition has existed within across thousands of years has often been one or the other. And isn't it interesting that in the modern era, really with the rise of liberal democracies, you see a glimmering of what I would call a third way, an attempt to build international order that's neither extremely hierarchical or extremely anarchic. And that would, of course, be order that I've described as liberal international order, that it's open, rule-based, based on reciprocity, bargains, where no one state dominates others in the extreme, where there is a kind of consensual agreement on the rules of the game. This is a very rare type of order in world history. You may see it a little bit in, as I've suggested, the post-World War II order among the Western democracies. You see it in Europe, post-World War II Europe, where the European project, driven initially by Germany and France, to create a new type of space inside of Europe for cooperation, exchange, pursuing higher level social purposes than exist in the outside anarchic or imperial world. Freedoms and social protections that we associate with a kind of progressive movement of politics. So the third way, that's the liberal international project that I've suggested has been unfolding over the decades. And it's in that context that you can see democracies building relationships that seem to violate the premises of realist style theory about empire and anarchy. And that is the liberal democratic piece, that there are opportunities and capacities for liberal democracies to do things differently, to escape hierarchy, to escape anarchy, at least to an extent, to build these more complex third way types of orders. Why is that? And this is my most direct attempt to answer your question. I think it's because liberal democracies have different interests, values, and capacities that lead them to grapple with these modern types of complex, interdependent, rule-based forms of order. So interests, liberal democracies, and this is as old as Athenian democracy, the theorists of republicanism from Polybius through Machiavelli and Montesquieu and the founding fathers of the American Constitution, that republics, polities with free people, want to live in a political space that is neither excessively hierarchical or excessively anarchic. So they have an interest in space where their kind of political life can play out, where there are protections against abusive exercise of power, either vertically from above or horizontally from competing powers. They have different values, as we've been talking about repeatedly today, that they want to protect. And then thirdly, they have different capacities. And this is where in my book, After Victory, and in my book, Liberal Leviathan, and now in my my new book, A World Safe for Democracy, I spend a lot of time thinking about how the capacities of liberal democracies to engage in order building that goes beyond anarchy and hierarchy. Remember realist style anarchy, the prisoner's dilemma, the fact that you can't trust other states, so you are compelled to fall back on your own devices, what Kenneth Waltz, the great realist theorist, called a self-help system. But liberals are of the view that their kind of polity creates capacities to overcome some of those dilemmas or obstacles to cooperation, that under certain circumstances, and particularly in a group of liberal democracies, the cooperation problem isn't best modeled as a prisoner's dilemma, but it's more like the stag hunt, which is unlike the prisoner's dilemma, which has a dominant interest in defection. In a stag hunt, you have an interest in cooperation, and the obstacle is building social trust. So international institutions built by liberal democracies have the capacity to create assurances and commitments and reciprocity and coordination mechanisms that let you solve the problem of cooperation. Now, notice that those capacities are not absolute. They have to be built. Notice that those capacities are primarily effective when you're in the company of other liberal democracies. And notice that you are not in any fundamental sense denying that you still live in a world of anarchy, that there is no world government, that you're still depending on the enlightened self-interest of other countries that you do not control. So in that setting, a kind of precious setting, imperfect, contingent, fleeting in many ways, there are glimmerings of possibility of escaping anarchy and escaping hierarchy and doing something different. It's been an awful and difficult process of getting there. And we see today how easy it is to exit that world. Donald Trump was trying to take the United States out of that world. And there are countries around the world today that don't want to enter that world. So I'm a realist when I come to the question, how stable and durable is such a world? But there is evidence, historical and theoretical, that liberal democracies can create an elevated form of politics that is an order that generates goods and values that you and I might want to consume.
I guess the final big question I have would be to focus a bit more, to kind of get away from that and focus a bit more on the part of your writing that kind of talks a bit about internationalism and international institutions more in specific, because I want to hear your take on the future of these institutions in a situation which it seems as though, so I think it seems in light of the new variant that's come out, because COVID's still spreading, it's mutating, and a lot of people think that's a failure of us to be able to be able to globally distribute in an equitable way these vaccines, but also in situations such as Brexit, which a lot of people have taken to have signaled the death knell of the EU. And we can name so many other things. I mean, I personally, worked in the UN this summer, and it wasn't pretty. Not that I saw any particularly high level stuff, but I think a lot of people you've been seeing these articles being like, oh, it's the end of these institutions, and it's the end of this international cooperation. And when crisis actually hits, the virus, what it told us is we've kind of failed to work together. And I want to hear what your take is on this and what you think the future of a lot of these institutions look like.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it looks kind of bleak. I think we are at a low point, certainly from 1945 and the kind of enthusiasm and systematic efforts to build a more rule-based cooperative order, that we are at low tide. And in some ways, the most basic observation you can make about world politics today is that there's been a kind of loss of the vision that we can find common solutions to common problems through multilateral cooperation. It's just not something that states, east or west, north or south, are really pursuing. A real sense that countries are in some sense finding it more attractive to fall back on their own national devices, and so a return to great power politics and to national scrambling national efforts to gain protection in the face of globalization, pandemics, and all the other threats that are out there. So I do worry that the kind of vision and program and ideology that has driven cooperation over the last half century, really 3/4 of a century, has kind of eroded and dwindled, and I don't know how you get it back. It's just a problem that I think we're going to have to grapple with. As a scholar, my efforts are really to try to remind those who will listen that there is value to be gained, both individually inside of countries and between them, in building cooperative solutions to common problems. The liberal insight is that under conditions of rising economic security and environmental interdependence, the cost of lost autonomy associated with making binding agreements is less than the gains that are accrued through the collaborative coordination of your policies. So that is a very deep theoretical proposition that I think has never been falsified or overturned by evidence, and yet states have only periodically seized upon that insight, and so I think that the case for institutional cooperation, rebuilding institutions, is a very important one. The kind of step back and say something more broadly about institutions. The liberal international vision sees institutions as deeply important as tools and mechanisms to solve a whole variety of problems that we've been talking about today. And if you think about our conversation over the last hour, we've been talking about problems in the world that, to solve those problems or mitigate those problems, some kind of institutional cooperation is needed. I think there have been 5 problems you and I have talked about. One is the problem of anarchy and mitigating the problems of anarchy, mitigating the problems of hierarchy and empire. Thirdly, managing or mitigating the problems of interdependence. That's just what we've been talking about, finding new ways to make interdependence work for people, to get the best of interdependence, the upside, which comes from trade and exchange and learning from each other, but guard against the downside, the disruptions and the insecurities that come from open interdependence. That's number 3. Number 4, liberal democracies, as I said, have a more demanding goal in their efforts at building order, because they want to be open societies in an open international system, and that is incredibly difficult. That's a kind of order that you haven't seen across world history, but yet it's been one that has come to life a little bit over the last 75 years, but we see it now kind of in trouble. And that's really the problem of liberal openness. And the solution to liberal openness, the mitigation of problems that come from liberal openness have been what we've described as embedded liberalism. The great and late theorist John Ruggie talked about embedded liberalism as cooperative efforts to create a more protective international structure so that our liberal societies can make good on their commitments to the people. We call that social democracy, attending to problems of inequality and job loss and economic insecurity, creating a more protective international order so that liberal societies can remain open, but simultaneously protective of the basic lives and well-being of the people who live inside of those liberal states. And then the fifth problem, kind of system structural problem out there in the world, is the geopolitical vulnerability of liberal democracy. This is the rise of China and the kind of agenda that China has that doesn't necessarily wish liberal democracy well. In fact, President Xi is betting that liberal democracy is kind of the wave of the past, not the wave of the future. And so the fifth problem that institutions can serve as a solution for is the problem of geopolitical vulnerability in the face of illiberalism. And so in these 5 ways, anarchy, hierarchy, interdependence, liberal openness, and geopolitical vulnerability, in all these ways, institutional statecraft, the generating of a more elaborated and consensual, agreed upon order through institutionalized cooperation is in each of those cases part of the solution.
All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. This was honestly such an interesting interview, and I cannot wait to be able to put it up.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and your questions have been tough ones, and I hope that I've been able to at least provide a few tidbits in responding to them.